Hi, welcome. Thank you so much for joining. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes here. I have Professor Erramilli here, who will get started as soon as he's ready. But thanks you all for joining. And in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and share some links in the chat for you to check out. But Professor Erramilli, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much. Welcome everyone to this webinar on disruptive innovation. My name is Krishna Erramilli. I'm a professor of strategy and I'm also serving currently as the interim dean of the Stuart School of Business at Illinois Tech. I have been teaching strategy for a fairly long time, and this is one of my favorite topics. I teach a couple of courses in Coursera, in our MBA program, Coursera MBA program. One is called Comparative Strategy, one course. It's a one-credit course. It's part of the Pathway courses. And a second course is called Innovation and International Strategy. These are the courses that everyone takes in order to get confirmed admission-wise into the program. So you will see a lot of me. If you join our MBA program, you will be taking some courses, and disruptive innovation is one of the topics that I lecture on. So that is me, professor of strategy, interim dean at the Stuart School of Business. There is enough opportunity for you all to ask me questions, but I would prefer that you wait until my presentation is over. However, as I present, if questions come up in your mind, please use the Q&A box, chat box, to drop your questions in, and my colleagues are monitoring these questions in the chat box. So we will address all of them unless there is a question that needs my immediate response. I will continue to make the presentation, and then we will spend enough time at the end to address every one of your questions in sufficient detail. All right, so are you all ready? Let's talk about disruptive innovation. Now, disruptive innovation is a term that is used a lot in the business press, in academic presentations, in industry presentations. The problem is most of the discussion that I see in the general public uses disruptive innovation in a very loose manner. It's not exactly how disruptive innovation was defined and described by Clayton Christensen, who was the original inventor of that term. So I would like to kind of go through this, and as we go through this, we will describe exactly what disruptive innovation is, as Clayton Christensen described it originally. And it's very important that we get the definition and the description correct so that we understand the phenomena that we see in industry today and correctly be able to identify it as being a disruptive innovation or not being a disruptive innovation. So it's very important that we get the terminology correct. I will start off by reminding all of you about the famous story of David versus Goliath, because that story has a lot to do with disruptive innovation. And then I will try to explain to you what this disruptive innovation is, the David versus Goliath case is through a couple of case studies. One is in the auto industry, and the second is the photocopier industry. And then I will identify what are called as footholds of disruptive innovation quickly. And then, based on all of that discussion, we will describe what disruptive innovation is according to the late Clayton Christensen. And then I will finish off my presentation by discussing a few other examples of disruptive innovation, particularly those in the last 15, 20, 25 years that have occurred. So then we will spend as much time as you need for Q&A. Now, in order to make sure that this whole presentation fits in about an hour or so, what I'm discussing here today is the front end of disruptive innovation. There is the back end of disruptive innovation, which is what happens when companies see a disruptor coming into their industry. How do they cope? I'll try to address that in Q&A if anybody brings that up. But really, I want to focus on the front end, which is what is disruptive innovation. So let's start with the story of David and Goliath. I'm sure you all have heard of this. This is a biblical story. Apparently, in the ancient Israel, what is considered to be today's Israel, if you go back into the entire history, in ancient Israel, there was this huge problem. We had a nasty giant by the name Goliath, and Goliath was making everybody's life miserable and creating a huge security risk for the king of Israel and the entire kingdom, in fact. There was a huge concern among the population that Goliath needs to be neutralized or killed. And so the king kept sending the best soldiers that he could find in his kingdom, and everybody got defeated by Goliath, and nobody could stand up to him. And finally, according to the story, David, a small young man, not particularly experienced in warfare, volunteered to go and fight with Goliath. People were very skeptical. You don't have the skills, you don't have the resources, you don't have the strength. How are you going to take on this giant of a man? And David apparently said, no problem, I know how to handle this. So we are told, as part of the story, that what David did was simply, all he did was take a slingshot and confronted Goliath. And he used the slingshot to hit the giant at his weak point, the weak point being on the forehead, apparently. And that shot, hitting the weak point of Goliath, was so damaging, was so hurtful that the giant collapsed to the ground. And then David took the giant's sword and cut off the giant's neck. And that was the end of Goliath. David came home victorious, and everybody celebrated his victory over this bad, nasty giant of a man. And then this whole confrontation between David and Goliath has, seeped into, our lore, and we talk about this all the time, right? This has become a metaphor in our everyday use. Whenever we see somebody large being defeated by somebody small, And it's the same thing in business as well. When a small company with limited resources, um, you know, apparently not very strong, not very experienced, takes on a big giant company and defeats it. That is what we call as the story of a David and Goliath in a business setting. So, disruptive innovation in many ways resembles the story of David and Goliath. It is a small company with limited resources taking on a giant company and defeating it. And so we call this a David and Goliath uh, confrontation, or a David and Goliath type of battle between a small company and a large company. We'll see some examples to see if we understand this better. All right, so that is the kind of the context of disruptive innovation. Let's look at a couple of cases. One is the auto industry case. I'm deliberately going back in time because I want to emphasize one thing about disruptive innovation. It doesn't happen overnight. It is a process that takes place over many, many years, perhaps over many decades, but it does happen. So we need some kind of evidence that um, when a Goliath is defeated, in the battlefield like we just described, that happens all at once. But when disruptive innovation takes place, it takes place over a long period of time. And I thought these two cases would give us enough evidence to show how a David-like company can beat and defeat a large Goliath-style company. I'm going to go back to the early 1970s. The big three car companies here in the US, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, at that time were absolutely dominant in the marketplace. They had upwards of 85% market share, the three of them together. GM itself had 45 to 50% market share. It was the giant of giants in the automobile industry. And they were probably the largest motor company, not only here in the US, but across the world. And, and so they represent, to me, the Goliaths of that day in the auto industry, GM, Ford, Chrysler together. Now, what happened was, because the profits are very high at the upper end of the market, right? Here is a typical segment, not a very scientifically drawn segment. Just it's a segmentation that is convenient for us to understand what happened at that time. So let's assume that the entire market was divided into just three segments: high-end segment, the mainstream segment, the middle segment, and then the low-end segment, right? Because the profits are very high at the high end and even in the upper mainstream segments, GM, Ford, Chrysler were churning out these big, large, fancy cars. And they were all gas guzzlers, as you can imagine, but really, charging premium prices and enjoying huge profit margins. That was the focus of their entire business strategy at that time. Consequently, what happened was these big three car companies were completely ignoring the low-end segment, the low-end customers. They were all ignored by the big three because they were not very profitable, right? So this is the other aspect of disruptive innovation. You must have a segment of customers that are being completely ignored by the market leader, the incumbent companies. And here the market leaders were the Goliaths of this world, were completely ignoring the low end of the market. And that represents the weakness the forehead of Goliath. Remember, that is in business terms, the fact that the market leaders ignore a particular segment is a sign of weakness that a new entrant, a new like a David, could come and exploit that weakness. And sure enough, Toyota entered the low-end segment in around 1970, 71 with their Corolla car. Now, Toyota was in the US prior to this, but they were not very successful. The customer perceptions that these are inferior quality cars made it very difficult. But what Toyota did was wait until there was a great opportunity opening up for them again, and they exploited that. Remember, something happened in the early 1970s. There was this big Arab or OPEC, I should say, OPEC oil cartel. It's a monopoly or an oligopoly organization. What they did was to increase their own profits. They cut down the supply of oil and raised the prices. And so that immediately caused a problem here in the US, a huge problem. You probably can go back and look at some of the pictures and the videos from that time where people were queuing up outside gas stations for several miles in order to get their regular gas for their cars, and the prices shot up, so this was a pretty miserable situation for American car consumers at that time. And they were looking for cars that were efficient, fuel efficient, that did not consume a lot of gas and were much more affordable. So the low-end consumers at that time were looking for more affordable cars and more fuel-efficient cars. Unfortunately, none of the big three car companies produced anything close to the kinds of cars that these people were looking for. And that was the opportunity that Toyota exploited very intelligently. So they came in with this smaller cars, but which were built well, reliable, good quality cars. They were very affordable, the price in terms of the price that the consumers paid, and they were very fuel efficient. So it was easier not only to not only to buy, not only to purchase, but also to own and manage over a period of time. And so you can imagine there was this huge pent-up demand for cars like this, and Toyota became a big success very quickly because of that. And they became very dominant in the low end of the market, right? Now, what was the response from GM, Ford, and Chrysler? Like it happens in many other markets in similar situations, these companies never saw any kind of threat coming from Toyota. They just poo-pooed it. They said, these cars are, they're not particularly good. Toyota is a very small company. At that time, Toyota was a very small company. They had, they didn't have the kind of financial resources or the access to dealerships that the big three car companies had. So the big three pretty much ignored Toyota altogether. And that is the other aspect of disruptive innovation. It happens when a David type of company enters the market, serves the unserved or underserved customers. The market leader more than often ignores the entry of this this potential disruptor. All right. So what happens is, as a result of the company getting ignored, Toyota getting ignored, they were able to, first of all, build a base in the low-end segment, and then use that as a springboard to move up market. Over the next 20 years, Toyota started introducing more and better and better cars with more and more features, more luxury, and charging premium prices. And they moved up market. They started now challenging the big three car companies very directly. Okay, so once upon a time, they were not necessarily competing against the big three car companies. But as a result of this journey up market, Toyota started taking on these big car companies directly head on. And because they had much better cars, the quality was better, the reliability was better, service was much better, the fuel efficiency was much better. All of these attributes were great, a very strong value proposition for customers in those days. And American consumers started abandoning the big three car companies and moving to the Japanese, especially Toyota, and international cars. At that time, when they saw how Toyota was successful, other car companies from Japan and Korea, they started entering the US market as well. And they followed pretty much the same kind of strategy, coming in at the low end and then moving upstream, coming in at the low end, moving upstream. And eventually, all of these car companies were directly competing with the big three car companies and taking them on. And because they had a superior product, and generally a much superior offering, you saw that American consumers steadily moving to all of these other car companies. And what happened as a result, within 20 years, the big three car companies in the US lost 20% market share. From a very dominant position in the early 1970s, around 85% market share, they fell to around 60% market share by 1990. And this trend continued over the next 20, 30, 40 years. Here is a chart which shows the market share of the big three and the market share of international car companies over this whole period, starting from the 1960s all the way through 2011. You can see how the big three companies lost market share from a very dominant 80, 85% market share in the 60s and early 70s to less than 50% by 2010. And how you can also see how the international car companies, including Toyota and all these other Japanese, Korean companies, they started becoming stronger and stronger, and they overtook the big three. So the moral of the story is you can have these giant car companies, and one would think that it is impossible to defeat a General Motors or a Ford or a Chrysler. And yet you saw this through this example, how it is possible for a Goliath-style company, a small company can come in, exploit a weak point in the giant's strategy, use that weak point to get established in that market, and then use that as a springboard. Once they become really, really good in their market, use that springboard to go up market and directly challenge the giant when they're a bit stronger, and they can then potentially defeat even a big car company or a group of big car companies. So this is an example of disruptive innovation. But here is, please, let me emphasize this point again. It was not overnight. These things don't happen in a single event overnight. it takes place over a long period of time. So disruptive innovation is really a process that happens over a long period of time. Now, it is true that that process is happening much faster today because of the rapid technological changes that are happening. It's much easier now for a David to take on a Goliath and achieve displacement of the market leader in a much shorter period of time. But nevertheless, it is a phenomenon that takes place over a period of time. Let me share with you another example, the photocopier industry. Once again, let's go back to the early 1970s. Xerox, which invented the photocopier industry, was the dominant giant, not only here in the US, but across the world. Again, around 1970, they had 85 to 90% market share, depending upon which source you consult. But once again, like the big three companies, Xerox was looking for profitability at the high end of the market. The high end of the market in this case is what we call as high volume customers. High volume customers are these big, large companies which have a lot of photocopying needs. And so Xerox was really, really good at making these massive photocopiers and leasing them to these big companies, industrial companies, and through B2B selling. And Xerox was really good at that. And they built their entire business model on serving the needs of these high volume customers. As a result, they completely ignored the low volume customers. Now, who are the low volume customers in the photocopier industry? These are physician offices, lawyers' offices, small retail establishments, small departments, government departments or offices, which don't really have the resources to purchase these large or even lease large industry machine because they don't need that level of processing. And so these people were completely left out of the photocopier market because Xerox was too focused on these high volume customers. All right, that opens up, that's a weakness in Xerox's strategy. And that opened up an opportunity for another Japanese company. Yes, you guessed it, it's Canon. So Canon came in the, again, it was in the early 70s to mid 70s. Canon saw this huge opportunity at the low end of the market. And instead of coming with these giant industrial size photocopiers, photocopier machines, they brought in, they developed these desktop photocopiers, small photocopiers, which were perfect for the low volume customers. They were very affordable and they exactly met the needs of these customers. And that is how they entered the photocopier industry, initially targeting the low volume customers. Now, what was Xerox's response? Once again, they completely ignored Canon. They basically didn't see any kind of threat coming from Canon because they were selling these desktop photocopiers, which were not popular with the high volume customers. And so totally ignored it. And that was fatal. Over the next 10 years, Canon moved upmarket. Instead of just confining themselves to desktop photocopiers, they started building bigger and bigger photocopiers. That are, much more targeted at the high volume customers. And they started taking Xerox head on, competing directly head on. And because, once again, just like in the car example, because Canon produced much more reliable photocopiers, more affordable photocopiers, suddenly the value proposition that they represented relative to Xerox was extremely attractive. And so many of these high volume customers started migrating to Canon. Of course, other Japanese photocopier companies also entered the market at the same time. And together, they represented a formidable challenge to Xerox. And within a short period of time, Xerox, their market share collapsed. And that process continued over the next 25, 30, 40 years. In 2016, Canon had completely displaced the market leader, giant Xerox. And Xerox today, around 2016, this is unfortunately the last chart I was able to get. Xerox had 17% market share. Think about it, from 85% market share to 17% market share. They collapsed, and Canon today is the market leader, 26%. So they displaced Xerox from that leadership position. They beat the giant. Now, remember, in both cases, the Toyota as well as Canon, these were very tiny little companies when they started this whole process. They were not particularly strong in terms of financial resources. They were not particularly strong in terms of the brand name recognition. They were not particularly strong in terms of their distribution capabilities here in the US. So they really fit that profile of a David, taking on these giants in the auto industry and the photocopier industries, respectively. So, disruptive, or there is a little difference, although they both look the same. What Toyota did, what Canon did, were slightly different. And in disruptive innovation, we call them as footholds. So, disruptive innovation originates from two different footholds. One which Clayton Christensen calls as a low-end foothold, where the new company, the David, enters primarily with a value proposition of price, low price. They are trying to attract customers based on pricing their products much lower than the market leader. And so that is called a low-end foothold, introducing a simpler product at a lower price. Whereas new market foothold is somewhat different. It's not so much the price, but coming up with an innovation, a brand new market, a brand new product that could open up and create a brand new market. There was no market called low volume copier market at that time because nobody knew anything like that something like that existed. So it was Canon through its desktop photocopiers that actually created that segment of these low volume photocopier and told them that, hey, you can get you can solve your photocopier needs by using our desktop photocopiers. So we make a distinction between those two. One is called a low-end foothold, which is primarily where the incumbent, where the new entrant competes on price, whereas new market foothold is one where you compete primarily on an innovation, on creating a new market, and using that as a springboard then to move up market and challenge the incumbent or market leader. So let's now summarize what disruptive innovation is as defined and described by the late Professor Clayton Christensen. So disruptive innovation is a process. Like I told you that it is not a one-off event. It is a process that can take place over a long period of time, by which a smaller company with fewer resources David, challenges the market leader, Goliath, by introducing a new product or service with simpler applications. When they come in, usually like the Toyota Corolla, which didn't have any of the luxury features or the fancy gadgets or the variation in the models that the big three car companies. So they were just simpler, just utilitarian products, cars that exactly met the needs of the low end customers in the automobile market. And in the same thing with the photocopier industry, we had Canon come in with a simpler product, the desktop photocopier, which had limited features, but they exactly met the needs of the low volume users. So with simpler applications in segments unserved or ignored by the market leader, okay, that is a very big fundamental point in disruptive innovation. And then they relentlessly moved upmarket to challenge the market leader and eventually displace the market leader. So that is the process of disruptive innovation. I'll be happy to explain this in more detail during our Q&A. But this is what we call as disruptive innovation. All the other stuff that you keep hearing in the popular culture, they don't fit into this particular definition or description. So they are not really disruptive innovations. So please be mindful of that. Now, let me discuss a few other examples of disruptive innovation. You all remember in the 70s, even in the early 80s, what was a computer? The computer was a mainframe computer. These were gigantic machines that only the biggest of companies, the biggest of organizations could afford, right? And they were, the people who could work on these mainframe computers were very few and limited. And so it was a very niche type of market at that time. The computing was a niche market at that time. And of course, IBM was the giant that was dominant in the mainframe business. And then along came the PCs. Initially, Apple introduced their Apple IIe, and then IBM and Microsoft then teamed up to develop these desktop personal computers. And because the PCs met the needs of a whole population that were being completely ignored by the makers of mainframe computers, that whole segment was completely it's like you and me, the mainstream consumers, they were not able to access these mainframe computers and were not able to use them. And so that whole group of customers, millions of customers that were completely out of the market, suddenly were able to access computing as a way to solve problems for themselves. And so the PCs took off during the 80s, and eventually they completely disrupted the market for mainframe computers. Today, the mainframe computers are only used in large mainframe computers are being used only in very specialized niche areas. It's a smaller niche than what they started out with back in the 1970s. So the PCs completely disrupted mainframe computers. So that is another example of disruptive innovation. Amazon is a great example of a disruptor. as you all remember, they initially entered in the book industry, book retailing industry. They took on, or they came up with this online retailing business model, which eventually completely disrupted the giants in the brick and mortar business, uh, being Borders and um, um, there's another company, Barnes and Noble. Barnes and Noble and Borders were the giants at that time, and today they have been reduced to very, very small players. Amazon is now the biggest retailer through their online retailing model. So they completely disrupted the brick and mortar bookstore business. Kodak was the dominant company in the film business for much of the 20th century. And but by the end of the 20th century, what happened was a few started companies, especially I think like Sony, developed digital cameras which were able to compete directly with the film cameras and the film business. And eventually, as you all know, the film business went up when the film companies like Kodak and Fuji went out of business. They were completely destroyed, went bankrupt. That is because these initial efforts by companies like Sony and Toshiba, I believe, and Canon, they completely challenged the traditional camera film business and challenged them and beat them at their own game. Once again, in this case, I would like to point out again, one of the reasons why disruptive innovation became so possible in the film business was, again, Kodak did not take them seriously, did not take these digital cameras seriously. In fact, it was Kodak who actually invented the digital camera back in the 1970s, but they never commercialized their technology because they were worried that it might cannibalize their film business. So they just kept it under lock and key. They should not have done that, right? They could have introduced digital cameras themselves and be still a dominant player today. But they didn't do that. That was a big mistake. And they let these smaller companies come in, introduce digital cameras, and that kind of disrupted the entire business. And of course, the iPhones, the smartphones that came in a little later, that really destroyed the film business, whatever was left of it. Uber has changed the way we order taxis, cab services, and they directly challenge the traditional taxi business and took them on. These are powerful companies, but they took them on and they beat them and they defeated them. Airbnb, a similar type of business models, but they took on these big hotels and hotel chains and they challenged them very successfully. And we are seeing how Airbnb has now become, and similar companies have become the main way we make bookings, hotel bookings when we travel. During the pandemic, a very interesting opportunity arose for these companies that introduced telemedicine. Where the traditional healthcare, like hospitals and clinics, they were much more focused on in-person treatment. Telemedicine made it possible for patients to be at a distance and still get the kind of treatment they they were they needed. They were able to um, talk to the physicians and get the kind of service that they needed from a remote destination, from a remote location. And then we also saw during the pandemic how Zoom, which was a relatively small player in the video conferencing business, suddenly became a giant because they took advantage of that great opportunity. That was, the Cisco, WebEx, Microsoft Teams. They were primarily focused on the B2B market. They were selling their services primarily to companies, especially large companies who needed video conferencing facilities. And the entire consumer B2C market was being ignored by these two giants. And Zoom, during that pandemic, found that there was a huge unmet need um, in the B2C business. And they took advantage of that weakness and they became a big player in the video conferencing industry. So these are some examples of disruptive innovation that we just explained. The process which we explained could now be applied to a lot of other examples. Um, the the frequency of disruptive innovation is increasing in the last 20 years, primarily because of rapid technological change that is happening. All kinds of new technologies, including now artificial intelligence. So this is making it easier and easier for Davids to challenge Goliaths. And so this is leaving Goliaths a lot more vulnerable today. The big giant companies can no longer take it for granted that they can sustain their business model over a long period of time because these little companies can come and destroy them at any given point of time. They have to be constantly monitoring who is coming into their market space and what type of business models they're bringing in.
Dr.
So,
Erramilli, at
yeah.
risk of disrupting, no pun intended, the presentation, we have a couple questions kind of that pertain to that slide. If you wouldn't mind, well, jumping in real quick.
Okay, let me, in fact, I'm done. I'm done
Oh,
with my presentation. So you can ask me any question now. Go ahead, please.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So the first one was regarding the disruption in remote work and the global distribution of ideas and high quality professionals. What are your views on the remote global workforce? And then there's a bit more information mentioning the founder of Netflix tweeting about Silicon Valley becoming a bit unnecessary now that you have access to developers, investment, and networking through digital channels.
Right. That's a it's similar to Zoom, right? Now that we are all connected through these remote devices, we can be anywhere in the world and be able to participate in workforce from anywhere in the world. You don't have to be physically present in the Silicon Valley. Is that what you're asking me? So it is a way to think about new technologies, making it easier for us to be able to challenge large companies that are in this business much more easily because we have these small players now having this access to this kind of technology makes it much more easier to beat them. So I think the what you just described is an example, could be an example of disruptive innovation, but it has to fulfill those conditions that I mentioned before. Is there a giant company right now that is leading the market and leaving a lot of untapped segments, ignoring a lot of untapped segments? And is this new model that you described, is it able to exploit those untapped segments? And are they able to move up market and challenge those giant companies? If you see that those conditions are fulfilled, then yes, it could be disruptive innovation. Otherwise, It's just another technology that is making making you work differently and from different places, and leading to uh, opening up the the labor market from a localized geographic segment to a global segment. Other questions?
Yeah, we had one that was a little bit more program specific, asking about whether or not there's multiple specializations within the MBA, and they're wondering if they can select two, such as the business and technology and business and analytics.
Nothing prevents you from taking two specializations. The only thing, of course, is you have to take additional courses. We have currently 12 courses in the program, right? 8 are core courses and 4 are specialization courses. So if you want to take a second specialization, you have to take 4 more courses. So instead of 12 courses, you have to take 16 courses. But if you can do that, absolutely, no problem at all.
Awesome, great. Another program specific. Can international students from obviously outside the US, can they attend job fairs if they're visiting the country?
I know we can, first of all, the MBA program that we offer on campus has a lot more support for career and job search. And the MBA, for example, a specialization like quantitative finance or business analytics, that would be what we call as a STEM designated program. And so for international students, when they come to the campus and take that particular program on campus, you get, after graduation, you get 3 years to stay here in the US and work, what is called as an OPT, optional practical training. And that opportunity typically is restricted to 1 year for a regular program, a normal program. But for a STEM designated program like ours, you can extend that OPT period for 3 years. That's a huge advantage for international students. So if you have some long-term goals, long-term ambition of coming to the US and building a career here in the US, my suggestion would be that you think about coming to our on-campus program, because that has a lot more service in terms of career preparations and opportunities like what I just described. So the Coursera program is great if you want to just stay back in your country and continue of pursuing a career there. Obviously, you're going to accelerate your career within your organizations as a result of the MBA, but it doesn't necessarily help you come to the US and building a career.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a couple more. Is disruptive innovation part of what has been named a blue ocean strategy?
There are differences. By the way, in my course, there is a whole module on disruptive innovation and a whole module on blue ocean strategy. There are some similarities, but there are also major differences. A blue ocean strategy is in contrast with red ocean strategy, right? Red oceans are industries where there is very intense competition and where companies are fighting to stay alive, to make profits, because there is so much competition. Everybody is reducing their prices, and your margins are getting smaller and smaller. Your costs are increasing, and profit margins are getting squeezed. And so it's a commodity. It's a commoditized market. No company has any kind of differentiation. So if you find yourself in an industry like that, you can think about launching a blue ocean by identifying an absolutely new market which never existed before. Very different from the existing market, right? And coming up with a value proposition, a product or a service that is so unique that it cannot be copied easily or imitated easily. This new space is called blue ocean, where there is no competition for you or very little competition for you, and you escape from the red ocean. And blue oceans can generate very significant profits for you, at least for a significant amount of time. And so that is a slightly different framework and a different approach to developing a strategy.
Beautiful. Thank you. We have one more here. How can companies effectively balance the need for their disruptive innovation with the risk of alienating their existing customer base?
Very good question. This is a problem that I think most companies are wrestling with. Let me give you an example. You all heard of Singapore Airlines, right? Singapore Airlines is one of the world's uh, most profitable airlines and a very reputed airline, known for excellent service and great connectivity. And they are routinely ranked as one of the best airlines in the world. And they obviously, their base is in Singapore. So this company has been doing very well for the last 30, 40, 50 years since they were established. But during the early 2000s or late 1900s, they noticed the trend that was happening across the world, where these budget airlines were cropping up all over the place and creating problems for these full service airlines. And in the case of Singapore Airlines, they noticed that there was this Air Asia. Air Asia was established in Malaysia, neighboring country, and they were becoming really successful. And they had a budget airline model. They practically copied it from Southwest Airlines, right? It's the same kind of model. So Singapore Airlines, even before Southwest Airlines became a kind of a major player, they realized that there was a threat coming from this company. And what did they do? They had the same kind of dilemma that you're talking about. Should we continue to, invest in our the full service airline, make it better and better, so that no matter which company comes to disrupt, we are going to be safe? Or should we take this potential disruptor seriously and devote more resources to neutralizing the threat from these disruptors? What they did was they came up with a completely different airline called Tiger Air. They developed that air, and that was not part of Singapore Airlines. That was a completely independent business unit. And they established Tiger Air as a pure budget airline. And they used that airline to compete directly with Air Asia and keep Air Asia under check. And so Air Asia never became a serious threat to Singapore Airlines, the full service airline. They were not able to move upmarket and challenge Singapore Airlines ever, because they had this budget airline that was there to compete against them. So it's called a fighter brand, or this is called a way to neutralize potential disruptors. So in this case, the company did devote resources to come up with a strategy to cope with or to defeat the disruptor. All right. But the point I want to make is they did not create that budget airline within Singapore Airlines. They created a very independent, separate business unit. They have to do that because Singapore Airlines offering this full service airline has a very different kind of culture than what is needed for a budget airline. And in this country, by the way, in the US, companies like Delta, Continental, they tried to introduce budget airlines within existing business units, and they failed because that's not a good model. So if you are serious about competing against a disruptor, you better set up a separate business unit and let that business unit fight it out with the disruptor. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me. I don't know if there's any follow-up, please feel free to submit a follow-up question in the Q&A box. But I know we are coming up on time here. I do see we have one more question. Maybe we can close out with this last one. Here we go. I have a query regarding the on-campus program for the MBA. Could you please clarify if there are any specific application forms that need to be completed or if passing an English test is required? Additionally, are there any other prerequisites for the on-campus program that differ from the online course or conditions for attending the on-campus program? Are they the same as the online course? So kind of a long one. Sorry about that.
Right, right. No, we do have the same kind of admission criteria. You need to have a certain amount of a certain level of GPA, a 3.0 or better on a 4-point scale. Or if you're coming from countries like India, it's a first class. We want a first class bachelor's degree. You also need to have English proficiency test, either using TOEFL or IELTS test. So that is the second criteria. And the third one, of course, is if you're applying for MBA, just like in the Coursera MBA, we need experience. So you need to show some experience. You can apply if you have all those three things. I don't have the admission link here, but I can provide it. If I don't know how we can do that, but I can provide or I can put you in touch with our admission counselor. So could you please drop me an email if you need more details on the on-campus program?
That's great. And I also just dropped in the chat just a big differentiation at the on-campus programs. And correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Erramilli, but on-campus programs do require a formal application, whereas the online program does not and goes through the performance-based admissions.
Exactly. Exactly. We don't have performance-based admission for the on-campus program. So it's a very different type of education experience that we are offering on campus versus online. And they're designed for different segments of the market, different target markets. So keep that in mind. That the reason why we have all these differences is because we are serving two different segments, two different target markets.
Excellent. So I know we're just a little bit over time. Thank you so much for your time, Dr.
Thank you.
Erramilli. As a reminder, the enrollment deadline for the online program is August 26th. We will be hosting office hours session, which is exclusive to those who attended this webinar and others who have expressed interest in the program. That'll be on August 14th, and the link is in the chat for registering for that. You'll be meeting with our enrollment counselor, Ada Rodriguez. So we look forward to hopefully seeing you there. But in the meantime, thank you so much again to Dr. Erramilli for your time.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed the session personally, so I really appreciate everything you
Really
shared with
enjoyed
us.
it. Yes, thank you.
All right, take care all. Thanks again.